"You had your notice, Sergeant. The community has standards." The voice that sliced through the quiet morning air was thick with a syrupy, self-satisfied smugness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I stood there, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth of the driveway, staring at a scene of such complete and utter devastation that my mind simply refused to process it. Where my father's cabin had stood just 3 months ago, a proud little structure of hand-hewn logs and river stone he'd built with his own 2 hands over 40 years, there was now nothing but a churned-up wasteland of splintered wood, shattered glass, and raw, bleeding dirt. The old oak tree whose branches had shaded the porch was gone, its stump a pale, weeping wound in the ground. The smokehouse, the workshop where every tool had its own sacred place on the pegboard, the intricate stone walls that terraced his vegetable garden, all of it had been scraped from the face of the earth, reduced to a pile of anonymous rubble pushed carelessly to the edge of the property line. My duffel bag, still packed from my return journey from a deployment I thought was the hardest thing I'd ever endure, slid from my numb fingers and hit the gravel with a dull thud. I turned slowly, my eyes finally focusing on the woman who had spoken. She was large, clad in a violently pink tracksuit that seemed to be waging a losing war against her frame, and she held a clipboard like a scepter. This had to be Karen, the HOA president my neighbor had mentioned in a panicked, whispered phone call just last night. Her face was a mask of condescending pity, the kind a particularly cruel teacher might give a child who just doesn't get it. The sheer, unbelievable, world-ending totality of the destruction before me felt like a physical blow, and her words were the salt grinding into the wound. This wasn't just wood and stone. It was my father's entire life, his legacy, his sanctuary after my mother passed. It was the place I learned to tie a fly, to read a compass, to understand the quiet dignity of working with your hands. And she had erased it. 4 standards. If you think that's insane, and I know you do, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I need to hear your own HOA nightmares, because I promise you, what you're about to hear is not just a story about a demolished cabin. It's about a war fought with paperwork, patience, and the ghost of a good man who deserved better. And it is far, far from over. Now let me take you back, not to the beginning, but to the soul of the place she had just annihilated. My father, John Ryder, was a master carpenter, but that title doesn't do him justice. He was an artist who saw life in wood grain and stories in stone. He bought this 10-acre plot of land nestled in the foothills back in the late 70s, long before the creeping tendrils of suburban development had even considered this valley. For him, it wasn't an investment, it was a covenant. He paid cash, a lifetime of savings stuffed into a worn leather satchel, and the deed was his, free and clear. The first thing he built wasn't the cabin, but a simple workbench under the shade of that old oak tree. From there, the magic began. The cabin itself was a masterpiece of quiet defiance against a world of mass production. Each log was felled from our own property, stripped and notched by hand. The foundation was stone he pulled from the creek bed, fitting them together with the patience of a glacier. I remember being 5 years old, my hands too small to properly hold a hammer, helping him mix mortar in a wheelbarrow. He never got frustrated. He'd just smile, wipe a smudge of cement off my nose and say, "Measure twice, cut once, and build it to outlast you, son." That was his mantra for everything. Over the decades, the property became a living sculpture. He built the workshop, a temple of organization where the scent of sawdust and machine oil was like incense. He built the smokehouse where he cured the venison and trout that he'd provide for half the old-timers in the county. He built stone retaining walls that curved with the natural contour of the land, creating terraced gardens where he grew tomatoes that tasted of sunshine and earth. This place was his heart, externalized and made manifest in wood and stone. When he passed away last year from a sudden heart attack, it felt like the world had lost its anchor. My last tour had been extended, and the guilt of not being there in his final months was a heavy cloak I couldn't seem to shrug off. He left the property to me, his only child, in a will that was as simple and direct as he was. To my son, Jack, it's yours now. Take care of it, and it will take care of you. I had every intention of doing just that. After my discharge, my plan was to come home, to this very spot, and figure out the rest of my life amidst the silent, steady wisdom of the things my father had built. I knew about the new housing development, Whispering Pines Estates, that had sprung up on the adjacent parcel a few years back. My dad had grumbled about the cookie-cutter houses and the manicured lawns that looked like plastic carpets. He'd mentioned an HOA laughing about their rules against wind chimes and visible trash cans, but his 10 acres were his. They were never part of Whispering Pines. Or so we thought, the notices Karen mentioned. This is Karen. I'd later find them, forwarded from my old barracks address. They weren't warnings. They were bureaucratic ambushes written in dense legalese, citing obscure bylaws and referencing a recent boundary adjustment survey. They spoke of unapproved, non-compliant structures and accumulated fines. They were designed not to inform but to be ignored, to be mistaken for junk mail, so that by the time you understood the threat, the blade had already fallen. Standing there in the ruins, the smell of fresh-cut pine from the slaughtered oak mixing with the acrid stench of diesel, I felt a coldness spread through my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced since my first firefight. It was the chilling recognition that an enemy had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war. And Karen, with her clipboard and her triumphant smirk, had no idea who she had just declared it on. She saw a grieving son, an absent soldier. She didn't see a sergeant from the Army Corps of Engineers who had spent 15 years building, and when necessary, deconstructing things in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. She had just demolished my father's legacy, and in doing so, she had just handed me my new mission. My initial shock, that hollow, breathless feeling of unreality, quickly receded, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. This was a battle space now. The rubble at my feet wasn't just the remains of my father's life. It was the site of the inciting incident. The first rule of any operation is to secure the area and gather intelligence. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my hands steady, and began to document everything. I didn't just take a few pictures. I conducted a full site survey. I started with a 360-degree video narrating quietly, my voice flat and devoid of emotion, noting the date, the time, and the address. Then I switched to photos. Hundreds of them. I used a grid pattern, just like we were taught for assessing blast damage. Wide shots from all 4 corners of the property. Medium shots of the primary debris field where the cabin and workshop had been. Then the close-ups. The splintered ends of the hand-hewn logs. The shattered face of the stone chimney. The deep, brutal tracks of the heavy machinery that had torn through the soft earth. I photographed the mangled remnants of the rose bushes my mother had planted, their thorny stems crushed into the mud. I took a picture of a single unbroken coffee mug, my father's favorite, lying half buried in the dirt, a small, defiant survivor in a sea of obliteration. Karen stood there for a few minutes, her arms crossed, a look of impatient annoyance replacing her smugness. "Are you quite finished?" she asked, tapping her pen on her clipboard. "This is still an active site. The contractor needs to level and grade it." I didn't look at her. I just kept taking pictures. "The contractor's name and company?" I asked, my voice still level. She huffed. "That's HOA business. You'll be receiving an invoice for the demolition, site clearance, and all outstanding fines. I suggest you arrange for payment promptly." An invoice. She was going to bill me for destroying my own home. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it was almost impressive. I finally lowered my phone and turned to face her fully. I let my eyes drift from her face down to her clipboard and then back up. "Ma'am," I said, using the term with the same chilly respect I'd use for an adversary. You and I are going to be talking again very soon. But next time, it won't be here. And it won't be just us. I walked past her, deliberately retrieved my duffel bag from the gravel, and headed to my truck. The first phase, documentation, was complete. The second phase, investigation, was about to begin. I drove to the local county records office, the engine of my truck a low growl that mirrored the feeling in my gut. The clerk was a kind-faced woman in her 60s who looked up over her reading glasses as I approached. I explained that I needed every document related to parcel number 4B-788, my father's land. I wanted the original deed from 1978, all subsequent surveys, tax records, and any and all permits filed. I also asked for the incorporation documents for the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. She nodded slowly, her expression sympathetic. "You're John Ryder's boy, aren't you?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Heard what happened up there. It's a crying shame." She disappeared into the archives, and when she returned, it was with a heavy, dust-covered binder and a stack of large, rolled-up survey maps. "Everything we have is here," she said. "John was meticulous. Always filed everything properly." I spent the next 4 hours at a long wooden table, the smell of old paper filling my nostrils. I unrolled the original 1978 survey. It was a beautiful piece of work, hand-drawn, showing the 10 acres clearly delineated, with the creek forming a natural boundary on the eastern edge. Then I unrolled the new one, the one filed by the HOA's developer 3 years ago. The difference was subtle, but it was there. The eastern boundary line had been adjusted. Instead of following the natural course of the creek, it was now a perfectly straight line that sliced off a sliver of my father's property, a triangle of land maybe 30 feet at its widest point. It was on this sliver that the corner of my father's workshop had sat. It was a blatant, fraudulent alteration of a long-established property line, a land grab, pure and simple, executed with a surveyor's pen. Then I moved to the HOA documents, incorporated 2.5 years ago. I scanned the bylaws, a thick document filled with tyrannical nonsense about the acceptable shade of beige for siding and the maximum height for lawn grass. And then I found it, a clause, buried deep in the appendices, about the HOA's right to abate any non-compliant structure on any property partially or wholly within its jurisdiction after providing 30 days' notice. They had created the jurisdiction with a fraudulent map, then used their own self-written rules to justify the demolition. I paid for copies of everything, my mind racing. I now had the what and the how. Next, I needed the who. I drove back towards the property, but instead of turning in, I went to the neighbor's house, an older gentleman named Frank, who I'd known since I was a kid. He was the one who had called me. He met me on his porch, his face etched with worry. "Jack, I am so sorry. I tried to call her, tried to tell her you were coming home, that it was a mistake. She wouldn't listen. She just smiled and said the board had voted." "The board, Frank? Who's on it?" Frank sighed, running a hand through his thinning white hair. "It's Karen, of course, Karen Miller. She's the president. Then there's her toady, a fella named Gerald, the treasurer, and a woman named Brenda, the secretary. Brenda's scared of her own shadow, does whatever Karen says. They hold these meetings in Karen's living room. Half the time we don't even know they're happening until we get the minutes, and by then it's too late." I looked past Frank, back towards the scar on the landscape where my home used to be. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, angry shadows. I had the fraudulent survey. I had the predatory bylaws. I had the names of the board members, and I had a full photographic record of the crime scene. The intelligence gathering phase was over. It was time to plan the counteroffensive. That night, sleep was a stranger. I stayed at a cheap motel, the kind with thin walls and the lingering smell of stale cigarettes, but I wasn't trying to rest. I was preparing for war. I laid out every document I had gathered on the worn formica table under the buzzing fluorescent light. The original deed, the fraudulent survey map, the HOA incorporation papers, The bylaws, the grainy photos I'd taken of the destruction. It looked like an operations map spread out before a mission briefing. My father's words echoed in my head. Measure twice, cut once. In this new kind of war, the measuring would be done with laws and regulations, and the cutting would be surgical and precise. My mission objective was clear. Not just to get compensation, but to dismantle the entire corrupt structure that had allowed this to happen. This wasn't just about my father's cabin anymore, it was about the principle. Karen and her board had weaponized bureaucracy, so I would turn that weapon back on them, but with a discipline and rigor they couldn't possibly comprehend. I spent the next 2 days creating what I called my Book of Karen. It was a 3-ring binder, meticulously organized with tabbed sections. Section 1, the property. It contained the original deed, the legitimate survey, and a detailed written inventory of everything that had been destroyed, from the hand-forged iron hinges on the cabin door to the specific varieties of heirloom tomatoes my dad grew. I researched the replacement cost of a custom-built log cabin, a fully equipped workshop, and the man-hours required for the stonework. The number I arrived at was staggering, far beyond the simple market value of the land. This was about replacing a legacy, and that came at a premium. Section 2, the aggressors. This section had profiles on Karen Miller, Gerald, and Brenda. I did some open source intelligence gathering, social media, public records. Karen, I discovered, had been a mid-level manager at a big box retail store before an early retirement. She had no background in property management, law, or anything remotely related. Her power was entirely self-anointed. Gerald was a retired accountant who seemed to bask in the reflected authority Karen projected. Brenda was a widow who rarely left her home. They were a petty tyrant, a sycophant, and a hostage. Section 3. The illegality. Here, I documented the fraudulent survey. I highlighted the state statutes on property boundaries and adverse possession. My father had owned and maintained that land openly and notoriously for over 40 years. A surveyor's pen couldn't just erase that. I also printed out the state laws governing HOAs. I found several key violations immediately. The law required all board meetings to be open to all members, with at least 48 hours notice posted in a public place. Frank had confirmed their meetings were in Karen's living room with no public notice. The decision to demolish my father's property was therefore legally void. The law also stipulated how fines could be levied and what constituted a curable violation. Destroying a structure worth hundreds of thousands of dollars over a 30-foot boundary dispute was not a reasonable or legal remedy. My final step in this planning phase was to formally engage the enemy. I drafted a letter. It wasn't an angry rant, it was a cold, precise, and dangerous document. I identified myself as the legal heir and owner of the property. I cited the original deed and survey. I stated that the HOA's boundary adjustment was fraudulent and that I did not recognize their jurisdiction over any part of my land. I formally requested, under the state's Open Records Act for homeowners associations, copies of the following: the minutes of all board meetings for the past 2 years, with specific attention to the meeting where the demolition was approved, the full financial statements of the HOA since its inception, the full unredacted contract and payment records for the demolition company, and the professional license and insurance information for the surveyor who drew the new boundary line. I gave them a deadline of 10 business days to comply, as required by law. I sent this letter via certified mail, with return receipt requested to Karen, Gerald, and Brenda individually. 3 separate envelopes, 3 separate paper trails. Then I waited. The response came on the 9th day. It was a single letter, on Whispering Pines Estate's letterhead, signed by Karen. It was a masterpiece of arrogant dismissal. "Mr. Ryder," it began, "we are in receipt of your letter. Please be advised that the Whispering Pines Estates HOA is managed by a duly elected board and operates in full compliance with its governing documents. The matter of the non-compliant structures on Parcel 4B-788 is closed. Your requests for proprietary HOA documents are denied. We do not answer to non-members." She had attached a second document, an invoice. The bill for destroying my father's life. Demolition services, $28,500. Site, grading, $5,000. Administrative fees, $1,500. And then a list of fines dating back a year for unauthorized structures, unmaintained landscape, and failure to comply. Total due, $72,850. At the bottom, in bold red letters, payment is due within 30 days. Failure to pay will result in a lien being placed on your property. I looked at the letter, at the invoice, and I almost smiled. It was more perfect than I could have hoped. Her arrogance was my greatest asset. She had just in writing denied my legal right to documents, admitted the action was taken by the board, and confirmed their intent to collect money for their crime. She thought she was shutting me down. In reality, she had just handed me the ammunition for my first major strike. She had no idea that her letter wasn't an ending. It was Exhibit A. The formal rejection from Karen was the signal to escalate from reconnaissance to active engagement. It was time to find allies, both on the ground and in the legal field. I knew from my military experience that a lone wolf, no matter how skilled, is vulnerable. A coordinated pack is a force multiplier. My first stop was back in the neighborhood itself, but this time I wasn't just talking to old friends like Frank. I started knocking on doors. I chose houses that showed small signs of personality, the ones that subtly pushed back against the HOA's sterile conformity. A slightly too colorful wreath, a bird bath that wasn't on the approved list, a wind chime I could hear faintly from the street. My approach was quiet and non-confrontational. I introduced myself as John Ryder's son. The name still carried weight here. Then I'd simply ask, "I'm trying to understand the HOA. Have you had any interactions with the board?" The floodgates opened. The third door I knocked on belonged to the Millers, an elderly couple in their late 70s. Mr. Miller, a stooped man with kind eyes and trembling hands, invited me in while his wife Eleanor hovered nervously in the background. Their living room was filled with family photos and handmade quilts. On their coffee table was a stack of letters from the Whispering Pines HOA Mister. Miller saw me looking. "The garden gnomes," he said, his voice a mixture of shame and fury. "Eleanor's had them for 30 years. Her sister gave them to her before she passed. Karen says they're tacky and detract from the community's aesthetic. We've been fined over $2,000. We're on a fixed income, Jack. We don't know what to do." He showed me the letters. They were dripping with the same condescending, passive-aggressive language as the ones I had received. Fines for the gnomes. Fines for a small flag from his Navy ship by the mailbox. Fines for their rose bushes being a quarter-inch too high. It was a campaign of harassment designed to bleed them dry and break their spirit. I listened, I nodded, and I took notes. I told them my story about the demolition. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "They wouldn't," she whispered. "They couldn't." "They did," I said softly. "And they're doing the same to you, just more slowly." Before I left, I asked for copies of their violation notices. They gave them to me eagerly. I was no longer just fighting for my father. I was fighting for the Millers. 2 doors down, I met a young family, the Garcias, who had moved in a year ago. They told me about the color of their house. They had painted it a light, buttery yellow. A week later, a violation notice arrived. The color, Daffodil Daydream, was not on the approved palette of beiges and grays. They were fined and ordered to repaint. They chose another color, a slightly different shade of yellow from the approved list. Another fine. The swatch they used was from a different brand than the one Karen preferred. They ended up paying a contractor, one recommended by Karen, of course, to paint the house a depressing shade of grayish at triple the cost. The pattern was becoming brutally clear. Karen wasn't enforcing rules for the good of the community. She was using the rules as a cudgel to exert power, to bully the vulnerable, and, I was beginning to suspect, to enrich herself and her cronies. She targeted the elderly, the new families who didn't know the ropes, and the absent like me. These weren't rule breakers, they were easy targets. After visiting a dozen homes, I had a file thick with stories of petty tyranny and a small, terrified but growing group of residents who were sick of living under Karen's thumb. I organized a quiet meeting at a community hall in the next town over, far from the prying eyes of Whispering Pines. The Millers were there, so were the Garcias and a half-dozen others. The mood was tense, a mixture of fear and hope. I stood before them not as a commander but as a fellow victim. I laid out my binder, my book of Karen, on a folding table. I showed them the fraudulent survey. I explained the illegality of the closed-door meetings. I showed them the pattern, connecting the dots between their individual struggles. "She keeps us divided," I said, my voice low and steady. "She makes each of us feel like we're the only one, that we're the problem. But the problem isn't your gnomes, Mr. Miller. It's not the color of your house. The problem is a corrupt, illegitimate authority that has overstepped its bounds. And the only way to fight it is together." For the first time, I saw a spark of defiance in their eyes. The fear was still there, but it was being eclipsed by anger. We formed a small, secret committee. Our first act was to pool our resources, not just money, but information. Everyone agreed to give me copies of every piece of correspondence they had ever received from the HOA. The paperwork war was about to get a whole lot bigger. My next step was to find legal counsel. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. I needed a professional, someone who knew the law and wasn't afraid of a fight. Through a network of fellow veterans, I got a name: Maria Sanchez. The recommendation was simple. She's a pit bull in a pantsuit, and she hates bullies. Our first meeting was in her small, unassuming office downtown. The walls were decorated not with fancy art, but with framed unit crests and a single elegant cavalry saber. Maria was a former JAG officer, sharp, direct, and with eyes that seemed to see right through you. I didn't give her a sob story. I laid out the binder on her conference table and walked her through it section by section with the same dispassionate precision I'd used to brief a mission. I presented the facts, the evidence, the timeline. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, slowly turning the pages, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up at me, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "Sergeant Ryder," she said, her voice laced with steel, "they didn't just break the rules. They committed grand theft, fraud, and a dozen other civil and potentially criminal offenses. This isn't just a lawsuit. This is a complete dismantling. The question is, how far are you willing to take this?" I looked from her determined face to the binder filled with the stories of my father and my neighbors. "All the way," I said. "I want to burn it all to the ground." Her smile widened. "Good," she said, closing the binder with a decisive snap. "Let's go get the gasoline." With Maria Sanchez on board, the entire dynamic of the conflict shifted. What was once a personal quest for justice became a full-fledged legal assault. Maria's mind worked with the same methodical precision as mine, but she saw angles and opportunities in the legal code that I never could. We spent a week holed up in her office, mapping out the strategy. It was a two-pronged attack: a massive civil lawsuit against the HOA and its board members personally, and a campaign to expose and delegitimize them within the community and to the state authorities. Maria's first move was brilliant in its simplicity. She drafted a new set of requests for documents, but this time they were formal discovery requests filed under a pre-litigation notice. The legal weight was entirely different from my certified letter. Refusing this would have immediate and severe legal consequences. "Karen's letter was a gift," Maria explained, tapping Exhibit A. "Her denial to you as a homeowner was arrogant. Her denial to me as legal counsel will be seen by a judge as an admission that she has something to hide." The lawsuit itself was a work of art. It was a 100-page document that read like a declaration of war. We weren't just suing for the replacement value of the cabin. We were suing for damages on multiple counts. Count 1, trespass and destruction of property. Count 2, fraud, based on the falsified survey map. Count 3, breach of fiduciary duty For the board's failure to act in the interest of the community. Count 4, intentional infliction of emotional distress. This was for me, for the Millers, for the Garcias, and for everyone else Karen had terrorized. Count 5, violations of the state's Open Meetings Act. And finally, the hammer blow. Count 6, a request for the court to appoint a receiver to take over the HOA's operations due to gross mismanagement and to dissolve the current board. We named the Whispering Pines Estates HOA as a defendant, but we also crucially named Karen Miller, Gerald, and Brenda as individual defendants. This was critical. Maria explained that it would pierce the corporate veil that often protects board members. We were arguing that their actions were so far outside the scope of their duties that they should be held personally liable. Their houses, their savings, their assets, everything was now on the table. The day we filed the lawsuit was a day I'll never forget. Maria arranged for a process server, a big no-nonsense guy named Tiny, to deliver the summons. But we didn't serve them quietly at their homes. We chose the perfect moment for maximum psychological impact. Karen hosted a monthly community social at the neighborhood's sterile little clubhouse. It was usually a poorly attended affair where she would hold court. We learned she was planning to give a speech about community standards and upcoming enforcement actions. It was too perfect. I went with Tiny, parking a street away and watching. The social was in full swing on the clubhouse patio. Maybe 20 people were there, sipping iced tea from plastic cups, looking bored. Karen, dressed in a flowing floral muumuu, stood at a small lectern, beaming with self-importance. As she tapped the microphone and cleared her throat to speak, Tiny began his walk up the path. He was impossible to ignore, a mountain of a man in a rumpled suit. He walked straight up to the lectern, right as Karen said, "Welcome, neighbors." Tiny didn't say a word. He simply laid a thick legal envelope on the lectern in front of her. "Karen Miller," he boomed, his voice echoing across the silent patio. "You've been served." Then he turned, handed 2 more envelopes to a stunned-looking Gerald and a terrified Brenda, and walked away. The silence was absolute. Karen's face went through a rapid series of transformations, from smugness to confusion to anger, and finally to a pale, clammy shade of fear. Her hands trembled as she picked up the envelope. She tore it open, her eyes scanning the first page. I watched her from a distance, but I could see the color drain completely from her face. The word lawsuit and her own name printed in stark black letters must have felt like a physical shock. She looked up, her eyes darting around wildly, and they met mine. I was standing at the edge of the property, arms crossed, my expression a perfect neutral calm. I gave her a slow, deliberate nod. In that moment, she knew. She knew this wasn't some angry letter from a disgruntled homeowner. This was real. This was a war she was not equipped to fight. The social ended abruptly. People scattered, whispering, a new and exciting energy buzzing through the neighborhood. The fortress Karen had built around herself had just been breached, publicly and spectacularly. The next day, the panic began. My allies within the community reported that Karen was making frantic phone calls. She tried to rally support, but the story of her being served at her own party was spreading like wildfire. Her power was derived from an illusion of untouchable authority. That illusion was now shattered. 2 days later, Maria received a call from a lawyer, a very expensive lawyer from a big downtown firm. He represented the HOA's insurance company. His tone was dismissive, arrogant. He called our lawsuit frivolous and an attempt to extort money. Maria put him on speakerphone so I could listen. "Your client," Maria said, her voice dangerously calm, "has committed fraud and illegal demolition. We have them dead to rights on violating the Open Meetings Act. We have a dozen witnesses ready to testify to a pattern of harassment and abuse, and we have a falsified survey that a first-year law student could tear apart. So you can call this frivolous if it makes you feel better, but I suggest you look at the personal liability claim against the board members. Your insurance policy for the HOA might cover their official duties, but it won't cover fraud. Karen Miller is on the hook for this personally. How frivolous does it feel now?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The lawyer's bluster completely evaporated. "We will be reviewing the case file," he said, his voice suddenly much more subdued. "We'll be in touch." Maria hung up and grinned at me. "That's the smell of fear," she said. "They know they're in trouble. Now the real fun begins. The discovery process. They have to give us everything we asked for, and I have a feeling that Karen's books are not going to be pretty." The lawsuit acted like a can opener on the sealed tin of the HOA's operations. The discovery process, that glorious legal mechanism that forces the other side to show you their cards, was where Karen's empire truly began to crumble. Her expensive lawyer, realizing the weakness of his position, couldn't stop the floodgates from opening. Boxes of documents began arriving at Maria's office. Financial statements, meeting minutes, emails, contracts, everything I had initially requested and been denied. It was a mountain of paper, and Karen had unwittingly created the most damning evidence against herself. We spent weeks sifting through it. Maria, myself, and a paralegal. We set up a war room with whiteboards and timelines, cross-referencing every piece of paper. The picture that emerged was one of not just petty tyranny, but systematic corruption. The first major discovery came from the financial records. On the surface, they looked clean, prepared by Gerald the accountant. But when we started digging into the vendor payments, a name kept reappearing: Precision Contracting LLC. Precision Contracting had been paid for landscaping, for fence repairs, for clubhouse maintenance, and of course, for the demolition of my father's property. The payments were substantial, totaling over $100,000 in just 2 years. I did a quick search on the state's business registry. Precision Contracting LLC was registered to a man named Frank Miller. A common name, perhaps. But a little more digging on social media revealed a family photo from Karen Miller's page. It was a picture from a summer barbecue. There she was, smiling, with her arm around a large man in a polo shirt. The caption read, "Fun times with my favorite brother-in-law, Frank." I felt a jolt of electricity. Karen wasn't just recommending a contractor. She was funneling HOA funds directly to her own family. The demolition of my property wasn't just an act of power. It was a payday for her brother-in-law, paid for with the dues of the very people she was terrorizing. This was the smoking gun. It moved the case from gross negligence into the realm of criminal conspiracy and self-dealing. Maria was ecstatic. "This is it, Jack? This is the kill shot. Breach of fiduciary duty is one thing. Using member funds to enrich your own family is a whole other level of illegal. The insurance company will drop her so fast it'll make her head spin." Next, we examined the meeting minutes. They were, as Frank had suspected, a complete sham. They were sparse, one-page documents that simply listed motions and votes. The motion to abate the non-compliant structures on my property was there, recorded as passing unanimously. But there were no attachments, no discussion notes, no record of the legal basis for the decision. More importantly, we cross-referenced the dates of the meetings with emails we subpoenaed between the board members. We found an email from Karen to Gerald and Brenda the day before the vote on my cabin. It read, "We'll meet at my place tomorrow at 7 to finalize the 4B-788 issue. No need to post a notice. It's better if we handle this quietly. Just a quick executive session." An executive session? Maria laughed out loud when she read it. She thinks using a fancy term makes it legal. State law is crystal clear. Executive sessions can only be used for a very narrow set of reasons, like discussing pending litigation or employee matters. Demolishing a private citizen's property is not one of them. She just admitted in writing to intentionally violating the Open Meetings Act. The evidence was now an avalanche. We had the fraudulent survey, the illegal meeting, the self-dealing with her brother-in-law, and a written confession of her intent to keep it secret. But we didn't stop there. We deposed the surveyor who drew the fraudulent map. Under oath, he was a nervous wreck. Maria questioned him gently at first, then tightened the screws. He finally admitted that the developer of Whispering Pines had paid him a bonus to straighten out the boundary lines to maximize the number of buildable lots. He knew it encroached on my father's property, but he did it anyway. He had assumed the old man would never notice or fight it, and when the HOA was formed, Karen had used his fraudulent map as the official boundary, inheriting the original sin of the developer. The trap was now fully built and baited. We had everything we needed to win the lawsuit in a spectacular fashion. But winning in court wasn't enough. I wanted to dismantle her power base in the community. I wanted the people she had bullied to be the ones to tear her down. Armed with the evidence of financial misconduct, I called another community meeting. This time, we booked the high school auditorium. We put out flyers, we sent emails, we knocked on every single door. The flyer was simple. Is your HOA working for you? An informational meeting for the residents of Whispering Pines Estates. See the documents your board doesn't want you to see? The night of the meeting, the auditorium was packed. Over 100 people showed up. Far more than had ever attended one of Karen's socials. The air was thick with anticipation and anger. I stood at the podium on the stage, a projector screen behind me. I wasn't nervous. I felt a profound sense of calm. I was simply a sergeant, delivering a briefing. I started by telling them about my father, about the cabin. Then I put the evidence on the screen. I showed them the invoice for the demolition. Then I showed them the incorporation papers for Precision Contracting LLC. And finally, I showed them the family photo of Karen and her brother-in-law. A gasp went through the crowd, followed by an angry murmur that grew into a roar. I let it swell. Then I held up a hand for silence. Next, I projected the email from Karen about the quiet executive session. I explained the law. The decision to spend $30,000 of your dollars to destroy my home was made illegally, in secret, to benefit the president's own family. The anger in the room was palpable now. Then, Mr. Miller stood up from the front row, his voice trembling but clear. "She's fined me thousands for my wife's garden gnomes," he shouted. Mrs. Garcia stood up. "She made us repaint our house 3 times and hire her friend." One by one, people started standing up, shouting out their own stories of fines, harassment, and intimidation. The fear was gone, replaced by a collective righteous fury. It was a revolution, happening right there in a high school auditorium. I had given them the information, and they had found their voice. By the end of the meeting, a recall petition was being circulated. It had over 100 signatures in less than an hour. The local news, tipped off by Maria's office, had a camera crew in the back of the room. Karen's carefully constructed kingdom of beige paint and petty rules was burning to the ground. The community meeting was the turning point. It transformed a private legal battle into a public uprising. The local news story aired the next night, leading the 10 o'clock broadcast. It was brutal. They opened with drone footage of the barren patch of land where my father's cabin had been, then cut to a picture of him smiling, standing proudly on the porch. They interviewed me, calm and measured, simply stating the facts. They interviewed the Millers, with Mr. Miller pointing to the empty spot on his lawn where the gnomes used to be, his voice thick with emotion. They showed the financial documents linking Karen to her brother-in-law's company, and they had footage from the back of the auditorium showing the angry, unified faces of the residents. The reporter stood in front of the Whispering Pines Estate sign, her expression grim. "A community in revolt," she said, alleging mismanagement, self-dealing, and a pattern of abuse by their own HOA president, Karen Miller, Ms. Miller declined to comment, but sources say the board is facing a massive lawsuit and a recall effort from the homeowners they were elected to serve. Karen's carefully curated world of control imploded overnight. Her power was built on whispers, intimidation, and the isolation of her victims. Now everything was out in the open, broadcast in high definition. The illusion of her authority was shattered, replaced by the stark reality of her corruption. Panicked, she made a series of catastrophic mistakes. Her first move was to try and use HOA funds to hire a PR firm and a separate legal team to fight the recall. She called an emergency board meeting, but this time, thanks to our public pressure campaign, she was forced to post a notice and hold it in the clubhouse. It was a disaster for her. Over 100 residents showed up, angry and armed with questions. When she proposed the motion to spend funds on her personal defense, the room erupted in shouts of "No" and "Resign, Mr." Miller, emboldened and now seen as a community leader, stood up and read from the bylaws we had provided him, pointing out that using community funds to fight a recall was a conflict of interest and illegal. The motion died without even getting a second. Gerald, the treasurer, looked pale and sweaty, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Brenda, the secretary, looked like she was about to burst into tears. Karen, for her part, was defiant. Her face was flushed, her voice shrill. "This is a witch hunt," she shrieked. "I have done nothing but uphold the standards of this community. You should all be thanking me." The crowd just laughed at her. It was the cruel, dismissive laughter of people who were no longer afraid. Her power was gone, and she couldn't comprehend it. Her next move was even more desperate. She directed the HOA's lawyer, the same one from the insurance company, to place a lien on my property for the $72,850 demolition invoice. It was a move of pure spite, an attempt to wound me on her way down. What she didn't know was that Maria had anticipated this. Weeks ago, as soon as we filed the lawsuit, Maria had filed a lis pendens on my property title. A lis pendens is a formal notice to the world that a property is the subject of ongoing litigation. It acts as a legal shield, preventing any liens from being attached or the property from being sold until the lawsuit is resolved. When Karen's lawyer tried to file the lien at the county records office, the clerk, the same kind woman who had helped me from the beginning, politely informed him that the property had a lis pendens and the lien could not be recorded. It was a legal checkmate. Karen had tried to use her ultimate weapon, the lien, and found it was a dud. She had walked right into the trap Maria had set. The lawyer, embarrassed and realizing he was representing a client who was not only corrupt but also legally radioactive, immediately filed a motion to withdraw as counsel for Karen, Gerald, and Brenda personally, citing an irreconcilable conflict of interest. He would continue to represent the HOA itself as he was paid by the insurance company, but the 3 board members were now on their own. They were personally named in a massive lawsuit facing a community recall, and now they had no lawyer. Gerald and Brenda folded immediately. Maria's office received panicked calls from both of them the next day. They wanted to make a deal. Maria was merciless. She offered them a settlement. They would resign from the board immediately, issue a public apology, cooperate fully as witnesses against Karen, and in return we would drop them from the personal liability portion of the lawsuit. They signed the papers within the hour. Karen was now completely isolated. Her sycophant and her hostage had abandoned her. The recall vote was scheduled. It was a mere formality. The ballots were mailed to every homeowner, and the results were overwhelming. 98% of the residents of Whispering Pines Estates voted to remove Karen Miller from the board. The final humiliating act took place at the official recall meeting, held in the same clubhouse where she had once reigned supreme. The room was packed, standing room only. A representative from the management company, hired to oversee the vote, stood at the lectern and formally announced the results. Karen was no longer the president. She was no longer even a board member. She was just a resident, stripped of all power. She demanded the right to make a final statement. The new interim board, led by a triumphant Mr. Miller, granted it. She stood up, her face a mask of rage and disbelief. "You people are ungrateful," she began, her voice shaking with fury. "I built this community. I gave you standards, and you've thrown it all away for a pile of junk and some garden gnomes." No one listened. A low chant began in the back of the room, started by the Garcias. "Pay for the cabin! Pay for the cabin!" It grew louder and louder until it was a deafening roar that filled the room. Karen stood there, her mouth open, but her words were drowned out by the collective voice of the community she had terrorized. Defeated, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the clubhouse, the sound of their chanting following her out into the night. It wasn't just a legal victory or a recall, it was a public exorcism. The aftermath of Karen's downfall was as swift as it was satisfying. With her removed from power and her co-conspirators turned into witnesses, the path to legal victory was wide open. The HOA's insurance company, seeing the mountain of irrefutable evidence, The self-dealing, the illegal meetings, the public humiliation, and facing the prospect of a jury trial with a dozen sympathetic local witnesses waved the white flag. Their lawyer called Maria with a settlement offer. It was laughably low. Maria's response was simple. "We're not negotiating down," she told him. "We have a number. You either meet it, or we'll see you in court, and I promise you the jury will award double." She had calculated the full replacement cost of the cabin and workshop, not at market value, but at the cost to replicate my father's craftsmanship, a number well into the high six figures. To that, she added punitive damages, the costs of our legal battle, and a separate fund for the other residents Karen had wronged. The final number was enormous. The lawyer sputtered, but Maria held firm. "Your client enabled a tyrant," she said. "This is the cost of doing business with people like Karen Miller. Pay it or pay more later." A week before the trial date, they folded. They agreed to the full amount. The settlement was one of the largest ever paid out by that insurance carrier for an HOA dispute. The check that arrived at Maria's office was for a life-changing sum of money. But the victory wasn't just financial. As part of the settlement, the HOA, under its new leadership, was forced to issue a formal public apology to me and my family, which was published in the local newspaper. They were also required to hire a licensed, neutral third-party surveyor to restore the original, correct property lines from the 1978 deed, legally and permanently erasing the fraudulent map. The sliver of land they had used as a pretext was officially and forever mine again. But what about Karen? The settlement covered the HOA's liability, but it didn't erase hers. The state attorney general's office, prompted by the news stories and a formal complaint filed by Maria on behalf of the community, had launched its own investigation into her financial dealings. They uncovered not just the payments to her brother-in-law, but a host of other irregularities, using the HOA debit card for personal expenses, falsifying invoices, and running what amounted to a slush fund. 6 months after she was recalled, Karen Miller was indicted on felony charges of embezzlement and fraud. Her trial was short. With Gerald and Brenda testifying against her, along with the mountain of evidence we had uncovered, the jury took less than an hour to find her guilty on all counts. I attended the sentencing. She stood before the judge, no longer the imperious president in a power tracksuit, but a diminished figure in a cheap blazer. She gave a rambling, self-pitying statement, blaming everyone but herself. The judge was unmoved. He sentenced her to 3 years in state prison, citing not just the financial crimes but the profound and malicious abuse of trust she had perpetrated against her community. The final piece of justice was personal. The court had awarded me a massive judgment, but there was one more debt to be paid. I still had the invoice she had sent me, the one for $72,850 for the demolition of my home. I framed it. One afternoon, I drove to the new headquarters of Precision Contracting LLC. Frank Miller, Karen's brother-in-law, was in the yard yelling at a couple of workers. He saw me get out of my truck and his face paled. "What do you want?" he grumbled. I didn't say a word. I just walked up to him and handed him the framed invoice. He looked at it, confused. "What's this?" "That's the bill for the work you did on my property," I said calmly. "You and Karen destroyed my father's legacy. The insurance company paid me to rebuild it. The state is sending Karen to prison for the fraud you two committed. But this is the bill you sent me. I thought you should have it back, a reminder of the job. Every time you look at it, I want you to remember what it cost you. Your business is ruined. Your sister-in-law is a convicted felon. And it all started right here with this piece of paper." I left it in his hands and walked away. The look on his face, a mixture of fear, confusion, and dawning comprehension, was more satisfying than any amount of money. The community of Whispering Pines began to heal. Under Mr. Miller's leadership, the new board went through the bylaws with a fine-toothed comb. They eliminated the petty, tyrannical rules. The approved paint color palette was abolished. The restrictions on gardens and personal expression were removed. The HOA was transformed from an instrument of oppression into what it was supposed to be, a simple organization for maintaining the common areas. The Millers put their garden gnomes back on the lawn, and this time, they added a few more. The Garcias repainted their house in the brightest, most defiant shade of daffodil daydream they could find. A sense of freedom and relief settled over the neighborhood. The fear was gone. As for me, I stood once again on the 10 acres my father had loved. The rubble was gone, cleared away by a crew I had hired. The land was scraped clean, a blank canvas. The insurance money was more than enough to rebuild. But I knew I couldn't just replicate what was lost. My father had built his sanctuary for his time. I needed to build something for the future. I unrolled a set of new blueprints on the hood of my truck. They showed a new cabin similar in spirit to the old one, but updated. Beside it, where the workshop had been, the plans showed a larger structure. It wasn't a private workshop. The blueprints were for a community hall and a workshop for veterans, a place where they could learn woodworking, mechanics, and other trades, a place to find purpose and camaraderie, just as I had in my father's workshop. I was going to use a portion of the settlement and a piece of my father's land to build a new legacy, one that would serve others. It would be called the John Ryder Center. My father had always told me, "Build it to outlast you, son." Standing there, looking at the plans, I finally understood. He wasn't just talking about wood and stone. He was talking about community. He was talking about justice. And he was talking about building something better out of the ruins. The war with Karen was over. The work of rebuilding was just beginning. Just